Greetings, everyone. My name is Triana Subianto, and I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at Baruch College City University of New York. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our online seminar on communication, technology, and environment in the Indian Ocean world. Sonia Das, an associate professor of linguistic anthropology at New York University, and I are co-organizing this event. We are both junior fellows in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is also generously funding this online seminar. In this seminar, we bring together different fields, notably communication studies and linguistic anthropology, to explore the connections between communication practices and technologies and the environment in the Indian Ocean world. We discuss manuscript traditions from South Asia to Southeast Asia and how the introduction of printing cultures change and inform the recording, dissemination, and consumption of information and messages. We'd like to revisit the historical processes involved in printing, including the making and trading of paper, ink, and printing technologies, and the import and export of other printing materials, and reflect on how these processes unearth the environmental and ecological changes, as well as the rich interregional and global exchanges in the Indian Ocean. We ask, how was the materiality of communication from manuscripts to printing technologies shaped by, and in turn actively shape, the social, economic, and environmental aspects in the region? It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Wei Jin Daryl Lim. Dr. Lim is a Singaporean historian of books and printing. His research focuses on regional histories of the book in Southeast Asia, the global histories of printing, and the technical aspects of print technology. His doctoral thesis, completed at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, University of Reading, examined the global and transregional networks of lithography printing in the Malay world. In 2019, Dr. Lim was the American Printing History Association's Mark Samuels Lasner Fellow, and from October 2022 to 2023, he was an early career research fellow at the Institute of English Studies, University of London. Dr. Lim will present his talk titled Origins, Origination, and Production, Lithographic Printing, Its Materials and Production Processes in the 19th century Malay world, 1826 to 1900. His talk will then be followed with a brief commentary from Sonia and me before we continue with the Q&A session. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Lim.
All right, dear Rian and Sonia, thank you very much for inviting me and having me as part of this series that you have kind of initiated. It's a great honor, and I'm deeply humbled that you've asked me to take part in this. Thank you too for that really kind introduction that you have given. Much appreciated, and it makes it sound like I've done a lot more than I actually have. So thank you. Without further ado, I'm just going to dive straight into my presentation, and I'm gonna just start sharing my screen. So 1 second. Okay. There we go. So origins, origination, and production, lithographic printing, its materials, and production processes in a 19th century Malay world. So what I hope to talk about today is really to offer everyone a closer look at the print material processes of lithographic printing in a 19th century Malay context. Broadly speaking, the history of lithography, it's based squarely, at least it starts in the 19th century, because that is really when the technology was discovered or invented by a Bavarian inventor called Alois Sennefelder, before it became refined, exported, and instrumentalized across various communities globally. In Europe, it is predominantly known as a method of image production and reproduction. Although recent research by people like Michael Twyman have kind of really emphasized the fact that lithography in Europe was very much also a technology for textual reproduction at the same time. It is just conventional histories of print do not always talk about these lesser known aspects of lithography for book and document production. So what I will be focusing on, though, it's quite squarely on what I guess we call the Malay world. This is a really loose and a really broad term, and it encompasses really a wide geographical span. Places I'll be focusing on today really will be centered around certain port towns, particularly Penang, Singapore, quite importantly, and also a bit of Bavaria, or what we know today as Jakarta. So really the history of lithography in a 19th century Malay world is often presented as a history of objects, people, and records, that is administrative, bureaucratic, or notarial records. To a large extent, that is very accurate. And studies of a bibliographical and print historical nature need to be grounded in really artifactual and material evidence. However, as I hope to present and to discuss today, this history of lithography in the Malay world, or really a history of any printing endeavor as such, should also be really seen and considered as a history of processes and of production, and consequently as results from a series of either deliberate or unintentional or ad hoc actions and decisions taken by either individuals, organizations, or communities at certain points in time during history. And these actions, historical actions, that is, often manifest themselves either intentionally again or unintentionally as printed marks and sometimes mistakes on a page. So to talk, I'm really just going to divide it quite loosely into 4 sections. I will talk briefly about lithography in the Malay world to give you an overview of things. I will then move on to talk about the products of a lithographic press, discussing a little about the methods of lithographic production and certain products and sequences that will happen. And then I will talk about certain observations, hypotheses, and questions before I will close with some concluding remarks, and I guess also to leave you with some questions to think about. So lithography in the Malay world, an overview. The adoption of lithography by, well, at least in this context, by Muslims in the Malay archipelago, it's really can be attributed to a mid to late 19th century reconfiguration of certain religious and social perceptions, which, of course, this came with influence from really what we call the centers of Islam, the Ottoman domains from Cairo, also from the Indian subcontinent, which kind of led to a really slow shift in local Muslim attitudes to the printed object, that is, and as a result, as a consequence, changing attitudes to the technology of printing itself. But moving back further in time to the very initial introduction of lithography into the region, it is really a result of being introduced firstly by what we believe to be English missionaries, but the historical record and archival record will actually show that the very first lithographic press was imported by Dutch missionaries in 1826. So just as a useful comparison, the 1820s was also a decade that lithography was kind of also introduced into parts of South Asia as well. In British Kolkata, it was there by 1822, and then in Bombay by 1824. And really the import of the technology itself was really born out of the efforts of expatriate entrepreneurs and colonial administrators and colonial and printers as well. So again, for a bit more context, by the mid-19th century, there was a lot of lithograph objects that were circulating within the Malay world. There were Qurans, there were printed books that came from Mecca, from Istanbul, and also from Bombay, the markets of Bombay, cities that had a certain kind of religious prestige within the Islamic cultural sphere. This also came back with the waves of really pilgrims or hajis that went to Mecca and to Medina for their pilgrimage, and there found printed books, printed objects, and brought it back with them. This meant that the objects that were brought back by these returning hajis often kind of became a certain kind of commodity that they could circulate, and circulation could often be in the form of manuscript copying of actually a printed text, and that would be circulated within local communities. This kind of proliferation led to a certain appreciation over time of what lithography could do for within regional Muslim communities. It kind of created a sense of efficacy of print. And this really kind of accelerated from the 1850s onwards with the commercialization of sea travel, with steamship travel as well. So commercial steamships arriving at and leaving the Malay archipelago for the port of Jeddah really helped to close that really vast oceanic distance between the Muslim communities of Southeast Asia and the religious centers of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula, in Ottoman cosmopolitan cities, and like I said, in places like Bombay, the metropolitan printing hubs on the Indian subcontinent. So what is really interesting is that Singapore was actually quite an important cardinal point on this Hajj journey. And it essentially served as a kind of a transit point for pilgrims moving to Mecca and actually also coming back from Mecca. And this is quite interesting because around the same period from Western Europe, you get also an influx of missionaries, predominantly Protestant missionaries that were coming into Southeast Asia. And in the 1820s, the movement of missionaries also, like I said, brought with them the nature of print technology. And with print technology, well, the initial idea was really to bring typographic printing. I will not go into too much detail as to why typographic printing did not take off initially, but a lot of it had to do and in summary, really with the cost of the technology itself, and also the nature of the various Asian scripts and what would be required for the production of Asian scripts in metal type. So lithography was initially brought as a way to expedite this process of printing in a variety of Asian languages. So this really ranged from languages like Tamil, Malay in the Jawi script, and then of course for a lot of the missionaries, the main thing was to print in Chinese. And this was really because of the interest that Protestant missionaries had in really entering imperial China to really preach the gospel. What you see here, it's actually a lithograph handbill in Mandarin that was printed in 1829 in a suburb in Batavia, so present-day Jakarta. And this was printed within the environments of Parapatan, which is actually an orphanage that was set up by the London Missionary Society by one of their agents named Walter Henry Madhurst. So Walter Henry Madhurst was really the man that kind of borrowed the lithographic printing press that was brought into Batavia by the Dutch missionaries and kind of found a way to really make it quite efficacious for the printing of Chinese, really. And also there was a whole range of experiments that was done by people that worked with Walter Madhurst to print also in Korean, in Japanese, in Jawi, like I said, and in various other languages of the region. So what we need to know is that while the missionary impulse to print with lithography was very much present, and Walter Madhurst's own accounts talk about how he used lithography to really duplicate the form of local Muslim manuscripts to help really to disguise their circulation to the local Batavian community. What was also interesting is that there were people that worked with Mathers while he was still in Batavia, and actually moved regionally to continue to print with lithography. And one quite important person is really this man called Benjamin Peach Keysbury, who was actually born in Hyderabad, but to an English family. So Benjamin Keysbury worked with Walter Mathers in Batavia for a brief period of time, learning to print with really typography and also with lithography. Now, Keysbury, when he decided that he was going to kind of be fully committed to Christian ministry, decided to go to New Jersey in the United States to study. He didn't really quite complete his studies in seminary there. He kind of decided that field work was much better suited for what he was interested in, and he eventually found his way back to Penang, to Malacca, and then finally to Singapore. In Singapore, he would encounter a really important individual named Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, or known quite popularly as Munshi Abdullah, who was a really renowned author, reportage writer. He was also a really skilled printer and also a really skilled copyist. In Singapore, Keysbury and Abdullah worked in a really collaborative manner. So Keysbury set up an orphanage and really a printing house where he taught local orphans how to print, and also local rulers started sending their children to Keysbury to learn how to print and also to read and to write. A lot of the early output of these works from Benjamin Keysbury's and Abdullah's hands were really quite refined pieces of printing. And this is one such example. This is printed in 1843 in Singapore. This is a two-color chromolithograph publication called the Syed Singapura Terbakar, which this talks about a fire that happened in Singapore. The calligraphy that you see, that you see in Jawi, that would be the calligraphy of Abdullah, while the printing was actually done by Keysbury. And as I would like to believe, a lot of the people that worked with them, the orphans that they taught, and also like their local assistants as well. Keysbury's skill in lithography, was refined over time with more productions. And one of the most well-known books that Keysbury and Abdullah kind of printed together or created together was the Hikayat Abdullah, printed in 1849 in Singapore at what they by then called the Bukit Zion Press. So this is a book that was entirely lithographed, but had a really quite impressive kind of headpiece or frontispiece that was printed in 3 colors. So 1849, it's really very early for a color printed kind of document with such a complexity. Now, if you look closely, you will see that the registration and the alignment is not quite perfect. And this was just part of the process where Keysbury was still trying to find a way to print in quite an elegant manner. He would go on to print the Cermin Mata, which is a really refined piece of multicolored chromolithograph magazine that was produced at really quite frequent intervals, and that is really a most important and really fascinating document. I will not show that here because, again, like I kind of mentioned in the beginning, the intention today is really to talk about the products of the local presses, the indigenous presses. And what I want to talk about is also things that people would have done, the local printers would have printed. And that would be some time after this period where Keysbury and Abdullah were active. Now, it's interesting because we often think of the adoption of print technology as a sequential event, but I think the material evidence shows that adoption is quite a messy, entangled affair. So what you're seeing now on the screen is actually a calendar printed in 1856. So and this was not printed in Singapore or in Batavia or in Penang or any of the more kind of like known port towns where printing was dominant. This was printed in Panyangat, which is off the coast of Singapore in Riau province. So 1856, in Panyangat, there was actually a lithographic press at the local court that was actually already printing documents. So this was a lithograph calendar, which is fairly large. I've not seen this in person. I managed to acquire this image really with the help of Marie Plum at the University of Leiden Bibliothèque. So really very kindly, she scanned and provided me with a high resolution image. So what we see is actually a really interesting kind of situation where local courts and communities already have the technologies in their hands. And this really, in many ways, links back to the Hajis that have been coming back from the centers of Islam that brought them lithographed texts. Now, we don't know for certain how the Penyangat court in Riau acquired the lithographic press. There's not much information. There has been a lot of research done about the printed documents, notably by Jan van der Putten. Michael Lafan has written a little about it. Virginia Matheson had described the environment of the courts in Riau and how the religious and kind of like a courtly environment was like, and how it was really conducive to returning scholars that would live in the court for certain periods of time. But what we know for certain from this, looking at this calendar, is that there was definitely a technical expertise that was present in the region, and not from missionary sources. And definitely the source of knowledge, the technology came from an entirely different kind of origins. So there are many reasons really for the acclimatization of lithography to regional communities. They are really varied, and we do not always entirely know the intentions because it is not always described. For instance, in Riau, there is a renowned author and scribe at the court, Raja Ali Haji, who had a really favorable view of typographic printing. But interestingly enough, in both his letters and also in the works that he produced, which quite a few of which are lithographed, he does not actually talk about lithography in a really kind of celebrated way. Some of his writings discuss and talk about the efficacy and the usefulness of typographic printing, but lithography and the mention of it, despite the technology being in Penyangat, it's a discussion of it in the courts is actually largely absent, which is quite a fascinating kind of lacuna. So I would like to believe, at least one hypothesis I had, it was that really practicality was a really key factor. Lithography is very much akin to the process of manuscript copying, and really in terms of labor and production, if you had scribes at the court who could copy text relatively well, if you had the technology of the lithographic press, you had sufficient stones, and if you had enough ink and actually transfer paper, of which I'll talk about shortly, really the transition is really fairly smooth and uninterruptible. But what's also really interesting is that this took place in a really small port town just off the coast of Singapore, and really you think about really the situation where there's an influx of technological kind of equipment, but also like really the circulation of local forms of knowledge, or maybe imported forms of knowledge that might have traveled regionally. So I'm going to talk quite briefly about the products of the lithographic press. And here I hope to maybe kind of perhaps shed some light on the process of lithographic printing. So lithography is what is described as a planographic process, as opposed to typographic printing, which is a relief process. And this is because lithography really takes place on an entirely flat surface. And the processes which allow a print to occur are very much chemical and also really invisible to the eye. So I'm going to just talk through a series of processes of how a lithographic print is, or a piece of writing is made and then is transferred. So you see in these two images, the first image, it's actually my friend Bona Izapanat, who is actually writing some text onto a sheet of paper. So what he's writing the text on is actually transfer paper, which is a really, which in this instance is really a sheet of paper, fairly translucent, coated multiple times with gum arabic on both sides. So Bona is writing with really a greasy crayon or a lithographic crayon, some text in the correct orientation. So before the advent of transfer paper, or in the absence of transfer paper, scribes would often have to write in reverse directly onto the lithographic stone to create a text for printing. The appearance or the technology of transfer paper, which is a fairly simple kind of technology, really allowed this really quite smooth transition of scribes to move directly from manuscript copying into lithographic copying. So in the Malay world, we do not really have any concrete evidence for scribes that have learned to write in reverse directly onto the stone. But if there was, perhaps it's the records are lost to time, or it is hidden in certain places. But as it stands, I have not personally found any kind of evidence as such. So a scribe copying text onto a piece of transfer paper, this would then be put into the lithographic press. Before that, the stone will be wet, or dampened rather, and then this piece of text on the transfer paper will be placed on top of the stone, and then it will be brought through the press several times to allow the image to be transferred onto the stone. What happens is that the dampening of the stone and the paper with the text releases the writing onto the stone, which has been prepared to absorb the ink from the pen. So this allows the image to appear onto the lithographic stone. And at this stage, it's not exactly ready for printing yet. What needs to be done is that the image needs to be etched onto the stone. And this is usually done with a certain kind of acid. Traditionally, and even today, is done with a form of nitric acid. I'm aware that there is a recent research and scholarship done on lithographic printing in the Indian subcontinent, in which done by Megan Eaton-Robb, that talks about the use of, I believe, soured mango vinegar, which is used in place of nitric acid. And there are manuals, local manuals in the Indian subcontinent that describe how the vinegar could be used and made. As a contrast, we do not have such documents in the Malay world that we can refer to. So the image needs to be etched, like I said, with the acid, fixed onto the stone. This creates a certain chemical reaction, which allows the printing ink to be rolled on and to be trapped by the image on the stone, or the text on the stone, which will allow a lithographic print to occur. When the image is successfully etched, that's when the print run can begin. So this is just a kind of really a brief overview of this process for those that are not aware of how a lithographic print is kind of created. Again, I do not wish to dwell too much on this very particular aspect because there's quite a lot more that I would like to talk about. And again, just for your edification, this is a different variation of a press from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, very much like the one that was used in a demonstration in prior images. The stones that you see both in these images before and in this current image, they're fairly small, but lithographic stones can be really big and really large stones will allow really a press to do and a printing house to do very different things. Just for comparison, this is a fairly large lithographic stone on a mechanized lithographic printing press. This is from the Labor Museum in Hamburg. This mechanized press is from the 1912. And if you look at the right side of the image, that would be the door of the printing room. And you can see really the size of the stone is quite comparable. It would be very, very heavy and would take quite a few people to lift and adjust the stone. But large stones are important because stones that are of a certain size allow printers to create what we call page impositions for print production, which is what I want to talk about. So just as a brief description of certain precedents for what I'm about to talk about. A lot of the research that I found was that, or at least my work has been built around looking at certain printed marks and mistakes that have been observed in these lithographed books. And I want to just quite briefly talk about certain precedents in the literature that kind of led me onto this path of observing really minute marks along the margins, along the columns of lithograph books in the Malay world. I think one quite important thing that kind of allowed me to come to terms with really lithography for book production was the approach that Michael Twyman has for studying lithograph objects, and it is really to delve really quite deeply into the technical manuals, and from that understanding, and also from understandings of conducting lithographic print experiments, be able to kind of look for nuances in the production processes and in the technical processes of printing. Another quite important precedent is also really to look at, I was able to kind of read a certain set of research and kind of a work that was done by Claire Bolton and Laura Canelos on really cataloging, actually printing mistakes in early European printed, typographically printed books really. And what they had was to collate a list of mistakes that they observed in early printed texts, and to really create a kind of a list of things that you could use to kind of dive deeper into the work. This is really interesting for the context of the Malay world, because what I could do, at least when I realized that there were all these marks that I was observing, was that in my PhD thesis, I started creating almost a list in such a manner as well. And I'll show you some of these marks and mistakes that I have kind of cataloged. So this catalog that I was able to create allowed me to have a tool to kind of really study these printed objects on a deeper level. The cataloging of these marks also allowed me to really think on a much deeper level about the stages of the printing process. And I think for the purposes of today's presentation, I really want to kind of emphasize certain stages of the printing process. The pre-press process, which is really any kind of manual, mechanical, or chemical action or procedure taken prior to the printing of a print job or the creation of a page imposition. There's the second stage, which is what I call the on-press stage, which is after pre-press, when a lithographic stone is prepared and is ready for printing. It is in the process of being printed, or the act of being printed on the lithographic press. So that would mean the printer and his assistant or assistants taking prints of the press and then setting them aside. And then there'll be the post-press stage, which is the third stage, which is the state after printing. So post-press processes are highly varied. It can be the drying of these printed sheets by hanging the sheets up. It can be the collation of printed sheets if they have been numbered accurately. And then it can be the trimming of these sheets once they have been folded and and then bound together into a text block. And also in terms of book binding, the process of decorative tooling, creation of a cover, the fly leaf, and so forth. So much of the talk today will really very much focus on the pre-press process, because that's when I realized a lot of these marks were created before it was printed, when books go into the press or go on press. Again, a diagram just to help you kind of create a kind of a visual idea of how a page would be assembled. So what you have on the right, it's a graphic diagram of a 4-page imposition. So page impositions are quite orderly methods of organizing pages for print production. And page impositions have hardly changed since the beginning of printing. Page impositions can be varied. They can be as simple as a 2-page imposition. They can be a 4-page imposition like you see here, or more often commercially, they can be 8 or 16-page impositions. I believe that most impositions used in the Malay world are most likely 4-page impositions. And I can talk about this at length later. Once impositions are printed off the press, they need to be folded down and bound before they can be trimmed to size as a text block or as a book, which is what you see on the left graphic diagram. So the blue page on the right and the blue page on the left, it will correspond to each other once after being folded down. It's quite tricky to really kind of explain in the course of an online talk. But for some of you who are lucky enough to have seen the process or have seen how a book is kind of made up, you will probably get it. We can definitely talk a bit more about this at length during the question and answer session. But impositions are important because they allow printing houses and printers to print quite efficiently and quite speedily. You're not printing 1 page at a time. You're printing 2, 4, 8, or 16 pages all at once, and then collating them and binding them together. So very pragmatic, very efficient, very commercially oriented. Page impositions are also important because they show you certain methods of how things are actually organized within a book, which is what I'm going to talk about. So what is interesting is that in a lot of documents in the Ottoman context, in the Indian subcontinent context, there are manuals that talk about printing, and also the Iranian context, of course, in the North Indian context. There are manuals that people have been able to find, documents that kind of describe the training of scribes, the training of copyists, documents that describe how books and pages can be made up. This is actually largely absent in the Malay world. There's a real noticeable dearth of manuals on the craft, even itself, of Malay manuscript production. And there's really no definitive explanation, and it is definitely a very interesting gap in the history of things, especially when we consider the proximity of contact that the Malay societies had with really the printing communities in the centers of Islam in Mecca, in Jeddah, in Cairo, in Bombay, and so forth. I think one reason that some scholars believe it might be the social cultural capital that was probably perhaps ascribed to instructive texts in Malay societies, and what topics actually merited being written down or printed. So for instance, there are numerous manuscripts and printed instructive texts that pertain to like Quranic exegesis, Islamic jurisprudence, esoteric divination, Malay magic, and so forth, that have been kind of copied and printed. But really nothing really very much when it comes to technically oriented topics that relate to craft and production, and especially the production of things like the book. So what this really meant for me in the course of my research is that now I mentioned the earlier precedents of European studies in European lithographic printing, where people like Michael Twyman managed to have acquire loads of lithographic documents or technical manuals that could be used as an insight into the lithographic printing process for those geographies. For the Malay context, I did not really have any kind of manuals or documents to work from. So what I had to do was to firstly to read European technical documents to understand the nuances of production. And then what I began doing was to start looking at Malay printer books in a much closer level. And this meant that looking beyond the text itself into things that were around the text. So, and things around the text would be things like really marginalia, even beyond the catchwords, which allow one page to be linked to the next for binding. This really led me to observe certain characters that were actually being printed onto the pages of certain lithograph books. So what you see here is a page from an 1873 book that's housed in SOAS, Esyair Unga Sol Jawab. And what I have kind of really highlighted in this image is really certain numbering, certain really numbers in Jawi that have been printed onto the central margin of the book. And this is really interesting. I'm going to talk a bit more about this, and I'll talk about the sequence of how these pages are organized. So the numberings often follow a certain structure, but this only really became apparent to me once I looked at a lot more lithograph books. And the sequencing and numbering of these pages or these bifolia or conjugal leaves, if you want to call them, it became more obvious once I looked at beyond genres as well. So this is a Esyair, which is a form of a prose poetry. This is from a different Esyair, which is printed in 1874, the Esyair Siti Zubaida. And again, when I saw this text, I observed certain numerals or numbers that were being printed. And it occurred to me that there was a certain sequence once I kind of made sense of what these numbers are. So in this very image at the top, you see actually the numeral 4 written in a variant of the Arabic 4 used in the Malay world. In the middle, you see a different kind of numbering that is being written as well. So 14, or what seems like at least 14, because there is a part of the number or what is written in the spine that's obscured. And the next image in a different genre of text, a hikayat, printed in 1874, you'll see a different variation of the numeral 5. So what I began to notice is that certain numbers are appearing in these texts. And one is that they don't go beyond 1 to 5, which kind of started to lead me to think about the structure of how really the choir or the gathering of pages were composed. So often I would spot the numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, often and not more than 5. Sometimes I would spot numerals that would go up to 15 to 20, but if there were two numbers, one would never run more than 5. So which is a kind of interesting kind of observation that I began to take notice of. So in this image, you see that what looks like really a flipped numeral 9. So this kind of threw my hypothesis into question. So what's interesting is when I started noticing certain variations, is that I realized that there were certain practices that seemed to be quite common in all these books that were printed, but there were certain unusual occurrences as well. Like in this instance, what seemed like a flipped number 9. So that really made me think on a much deeper level about what these marks could have meant. And it was really only after I started looking at certain Qurans that were printed in Singapore that things became slightly clearer to me. So again, this is another Shair printed in 1898. This seems very much like an obscured Jawi 4, or what seems to be it. And then texts that are printed much later, I started noticing also what we call, I guess, just for terms of differentiation, Western numerals. So you see in this image, a number 40 printed in the center of the page. So what I really started to realize that there were 2 sequences of numberings that were occurring. For pages or spreads where I saw 1 to 5, they would often repeat if there was a second quire in the book. So quire would be a gathering of pages. For pages that would have numbers that would run into much larger digits, for instance, like 40, they would often run in tandem usually. So there will be the numbers that will run from 1 to 5, and then there will be numbers that run from, for example, 1 to 40, 1 to 20. What I began to realize is that the numbers that ran much larger seemed almost to be a way to track the number of quires that needed to be printed for these books. So again, another example, this is the number 2 that's hidden under the conservation tape in another Shair that's printed. And in the case of this, it's what seems like a number 34 running again beyond five pages. So this would be what I started to think was a way again to track the number of quires in this text. So at this stage, I had many ideas, I had many hypotheses, but then I encountered a Quran printer in Singapore, and that kind of gave me a certain kind of, at least on one level, a confirmation about what these numbers actually could mean. So this is a Quran that's lithographed in Singapore. It's undated, but presumably dated to the late 1880s, 1890s. This is housed at the mosque in Yogyakarta. And in this image, it's quite interesting because you see 3 quite distinct marks that I've kind of highlighted. You see the numeral 3, Jawi numeral 3 in the middle of the page spread, and you see 2 lines, one at the top and one at the bottom of the page. Looking at this Quran and a few others like it, printed in such a same manner of the same dimensions, gave me a certain kind of insight. So I started developing a hypothesis that it's quite possible that a lot of the books, especially the larger ones, would be done up as 4-page impositions, or perhaps 2-page impositions if the books were smaller, or were kind of transferred to a smaller stone, that is. And that really kind of allowed me to kind of figure out what the sequence could be. So in the Qurans, again, I spotted the same sequence of numbering. There will be one sequence of numbers that will run fairly large, and another sequence of numbers that will run from 1 to 5. So before I talk a little further about the sequencing of the pages and the numbers and collation, I want to briefly talk about the layout system that's used in this Singapore printed Qurans, because what it does is it allows for quite an efficient way of printing, really. So the Qurans printed in Singapore use a really specific way of organizing the Quranic text, and it is called ayah bekana. Probably saying it wrongly, but it's a way of dividing the Quran into 30 juz, and each page will consist of 15 lines of text. So what this does is that each line of text, each juz would consist of 20 pages, which in terms of printing, it's really efficient. And when you look, sorry.
We only have just 3 more minutes.
Oh, right. Sorry. Okay, I didn't realize I was talking at such length. I'll quickly wrap it up. So the organization of the pages meant that printing could be quite efficient for these Qurans, and this would allow the printers in Singapore to really have quite a coordinated and very structured way of printing on the lithographic press, really. And you'll see that the sequencing of numbers, so you can see the top number would be one that runs fairly large. So, and then the one in the middle, which would run right up to 5. And again, this would be a number 5. So that would be a different variation of writing 5. And then here you see 3 and 4. So really what this kind of really illustrates is that there is really a conflation of both types of practices of book imposition. And page imposition is something that is very much from a Western kind of bookmaking tradition. And then you get really practices drawn from an Ottoman scriptoria in a Malay world context, in which the numbering of pages utilizes local variations of numbering the text, or sequencing processes, technical processes for production. And it really goes back to the idea that really I kind of mentioned initially about how the sequencing of things and how really the transmission of things historically are quite entangled. Really illustrated again by this book that was printed in Penang, which uses a combination of Western numerals and then here a Malay numeral. So Rian, do I have time to conclude, make some conclusions, or if you need me to stop, I can actually, I'm quite happy to stop here, and then you can always
you can give us your conclusion.
Yeah, okay, great. So I think what I really want to emphasize is that the nature of bookmaking in the Malay world, it's not a singular linear kind of process. It is entangled. It is quite messy, and it draws on influences from a variety of traditions, a variety of histories. And it's not as simple as really as talking about a technology being indigenized. I kind of really prefer the term localization because it talks about a more adaptive process that is less about the idea of really dominating an idea, or really kind of having something kind of become something else fully. In a way, I think it kind of really speaks to that whole really ad hoc nature of printing in the Malay world itself. It is highly pragmatic. It is full of mistakes, and it's full of curiosities and questions, really. Yeah. And I think we can probably end that, and we can probably go into the Q&A if we would like, if there's time for it, that is. But yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you all for bearing with me. I didn't realize that I have been talking so much for so long.
No, this is great. There's a lot of information. It's so stimulating, and I really appreciate the talk and everything that you presented for us. What we're gonna do now, we're going to move on to some very brief commentary from me and Sonia, and then move on to Q&A. I think I'm going to really make it my commentary very short, right? In communication studies, in media and communication studies, where I am trained at, when we look at an object like this, right, this is really interesting because when you look at this object, for you, this is an object of, material text. For us, it's an object of communication, right? That store information, that transmit information. And so in the field of media studies, and there are a lot of my students actually present to us, present here with us. So they're all familiar with this debate, that in the field of communication, right, a lot of the field is caught in the so-called media presentism. That's David Morley's term. He said that it's a fascination for the communication technologies of the present, with little regard for the historical continuities of past technologies and their attendant logic that will shape contemporary communications. So a lot of the study in current media studies focuses so much on digital media as if there is not really a relationship with previous evolution of previous technology, which is in this case lithography and printing technology, right? So that's the first problem. The second problem is, obviously Western centrism. And so when we in our classes usually, and this is also my the challenge that I have as a professor, is that oftentimes textbook will talk about printing history from the, focusing on Gutenberg, and then with a very brief mention, maybe a phrase, not even a sentence, mentioning that China and the Arab world also have its actually predated Western invention, but there is not so much detailed into it, right? So it often leads students of media studies that as if the processes involved in printing development globally, as if it were the same, which is what you said before. It's as if the indigenous people just adopted it, and then all of those processes of adoption is similar all over the world. And what I learned from you, and this is why I think what you do, with the study of the materiality of the text, it really offers a perspective for us to expand the limits of my field, right? Because what you do, you help us understand the specific processes and materials from within the region, right? From, in this case, the Malay world, right? And how there is this very rich interregional connections, often separate and untouched from the West, but it's also obviously related to the West, but I like what you say, messy, and then so another thing that I really like from what you do is that when we look at, again, the field is very much dominated with the study of digital media, right? And especially when we think about materiality of text today, in terms of in terms of digital media, there is very rich history. Rick Maxwell, Marwan Kraidi, these are people in the field. They have all showed how digital media, when we see it from the materiality, are very global. They involve laborers who dig nickels in Indonesia, still war in bloody Congo, where important mineral, which is coltan, is mined. And then there are also casual laborers in China, right? And not to mention, the importation of digital waste to poor countries from the West. But this is where I want to go next for the conversation. The world is global today, obviously. But from your presentation, the world, even in the printing period, before digital age, was already very global, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So I want to know more about how this global interconnection happened. You mentioned a little bit on that, but I especially want to see how would you use the lens of empire and colonialism, because the context at the time was colonialism. You do mention about Dutch missionary, but to what extent, colonialism figure into this history of typography in the field, right? Lithography in the field. And maybe a way to get there is by thinking about really labors and the environment. And what I mean by that is this. You mentioned after 1950s, right, with the commercial steamships and everything, so there is more and more needs for printing. My question is, was there ever lithography or printing in general has it ever been industrialized under colonialism? And if it was industrialized, right? In what way did this industrialization change the environment? For example, did it ever force people to cultivate particular trees in the region to produce the ink, to produce the transfer paper, or to produce paper in general for lithography or printing in general? So to what extent are land that has been used to, to cultivate certain crops are, they are transferred into, they're changed into to produce other production of other trees, for example, specifically for lithography? And if so, what regions in the Malay world that were affected by this industry? But there's so many questions, and your talk is so inspiring, but I'm gonna let Sonia talk now, and then we have Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Das. Again, I'm an associate professor of linguistic anthropology at NYU, New York University. As a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows for Critical Bibliography, I am inclined to think about the creation and circulation of material objects involved in book history as indexical of broader social, economic, and political processes, linking together local regions, nation states, and other more globally oriented formations such as diasporas. As a linguistic anthropologist, I'm also trained to trace the interdiscursive processes linking together material objects and practices that are relevant to the way that people communicate through spoken and written languages. And so through this, one can make sense of politics, identities, inequalities, and other outcomes of social relations. So thank you all for attending this talk that Rian Subianto and I have co-organized in the spirit of interdisciplinary study of communication across the humanities and humanistic social sciences. So most of all, thank you, Daryl, for this fascinating discussion of Malay lithography in the 19th century. I really appreciate your careful discussion of what you call nonlinear historical processes by detailing the range of printing influences from across the Indian Ocean on bookmaking innovation in the Malay world. And so by considering the impact of print technological changes originating in the Ottoman domains, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian bazaars, etc., you have articulated and diagrammed the contours of what I call an interdiscursive domain and justify the importance of exploring the back and forth dissemination of knowledge, technologies, discourses, and material objects across a broadly conceived terrain. So I found that your research really inspires me as a linguistic anthropologist who has done research on typographic printing in the Tamil-speaking world, encompassing both Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean regions. After listening to your talk, I find myself wanting to pay more attention to the coexistence of lithography and typographic printing in the 19th century. This is something that I just thought of in listening to your talk. I'm really interested in how you're thinking about mistakes and how those in the Malay world in the 19th century become seen as errors at a larger scale, or whether or not they do. And so kind of interested in this process by which something is being seen as a mistake or an error is being seen as something more than just a curiosity, and is suggestive of either processes of valorization or devalorization of printing cultures and traditions in colonial contexts. So I have a few questions. Obviously, I don't expect you to answer all of these. So first, I think you already answered this, but how did you know to examine Ottoman, Arabian, and Indian bookmaking techniques and see these as relevant to the use of hand presses in 19th century Batavia and the larger Malay context? Second, could you comment on how the study of printing and bookmaking is key to understanding the articulation of power through communicative technologies during the height of colonial rule? So again, I'm really interested in this kind of context of colonialism. And then I'm just going to skip ahead. I'd love to hear any of your thoughts about how book history is relevant to understanding contemporary society and politics in Southeast Asia. So are these historical and trans-regional connections celebrated or recognized today in popular understandings of local forms of printing and bookmaking, or have they been historically erased? And what do you think are some of the consequences of this recognition or erasure for the politics of nationhood? So thank you once again for this thought-provoking talk. I'd like to turn it over now to the remaining time for Q&A and give Daryl some time to respond. Thank you. So if you can please raise your hand, and I will allow you to speak or give you permission to speak through the Zoom. And as we wait, Daryl, if you want to begin by making any comments, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I guess I'll just begin by just talking a bit loosely at length. So like Rian, you asked about changes to the physical space of the Malay world, broadly speaking, and also how this might have impacted like spaces of materials, production for materials. That's a really good question that you asked, because we know that for a lot of the materials in by the late 19th century, a lot of the paper was imported, often made in China, and sometimes in the Indian subcontinent, and then imported into the Malay world to be used. Same with the use of transfer paper. So transfer paper is interesting because at its most basic, it can be made, like I said, just with paper that's a little translucent and with gum arabic and left to dry. Because we do not really have much administrative records from the printing houses themselves in the Malay world. So I believe there have been people that have been able to trace. So I think Annabelle actually herself, some of her writings have looked at printing seals or printing block seals on some paper in Malay manuscripts or printed Malay books. And by tracing backwards, she was able to identify where certain paper sources were from. I believe there's also Devin Fitzgerald in the US who has done some work on that as well, especially on paper. Again, I kind of just citing these instances because I've not actually had time to really look into the sources of paper per se yet. Much of my thesis was very much focusing on the granularity of the processes of production. With regards to other materials, things like the lithographic stone, again, we do not really have records of where a lot of them came from. We know for certain that by the mid 1820s in Batavia, they found quite significant sources of local limestone that could be mined and used. And London missionaries did, in fact, hew stones to be cut to size to be used. But for some reason, in Singapore, for instance, there are records of people like Benjamin Keysbury, who ran that orphanage and who is doing all those color printing that I showed you. He did not actually find local sources of stone or even regional sources of stone. He ended up ordering stones from Germany. I'm also aware that in India themselves, there's quite a lot of rich sources of limestone on the Deccan Plateau. And I believe Megan Eaton-Robb's research has also kind of spoken a little about how a lot of the Indian lithographic printers also ended up, for one reason or another, importing stones from Germany into India to be used for printing. So it's a real curious kind of question as to why look abroad when you have local sources. It could be the sheer availability of German lithographic stones. It could be the affordability. We don't really quite know for sure. It's definitely something that it's worth investigating deeper, like the sources of paper, for instance. Same with ink. And of course, there's one thing actually that has been on my mind a lot. It's actually, and this really ties back to the international flows of materials and chemicals and goods. In lithography, there's a lot of talk about the stones, the paper, the presses, the inks. But people forget that one of the most important components is actually gum arabic. And gum arabic is used in such a huge quantity in the lithographic printing process. But even in many European manuals of the 19th century, you find vague mention of where they come from. Even today, we do not really have much good scholarly research or literature on the sources of Gum Arabic. I might have only found one book so far that kind of really investigates the origins of Gum Arabic, and a lot of it comes from Sahel Desert, and we do not know very much else of where it comes from. Oh yes, I see Annabelle's question, and she's asking, could I tell everyone how I think Penyagat in Riau might have obtained its lithographic press, if not via the missionary route? That there is something definitely we do not really know very much about. I believe Jan van der Putten has done some research about the printing, lithographic printing by the court in Penyagat. I don't really have a clear memory actually of whether or not Jan talks about the source of the lithographic press itself. Yeah, there's some talk about the Well, I guess it's at this point that I should say that I don't actually know where the press might have come from, because I do not have enough information. But I think there are some hypotheses that people have. It's definitely something to really, I guess, think about. One potential possibility is that so we know that there is there were presses already in South Sumatra, in Palembang, which used to print one of the earliest Qurans in the Malay world. And I believe Ali Akbar has written quite a bit about it. So 1848, there was a lithographic press in Palembang. And this press we know for certain because the colophon of that Quran states that the press was bought from Singapore. As to what make the press, as in who the manufacturer is, or the type, or the size of it, we don't actually know. One possible hypothesis is that it could have come from merchant sources in Singapore, and it would be perfectly reasonable that the Penyagat court had the means to actually acquire a lithographic press from Singapore, and this would be a lithographic hand press. Yeah. So fairly transportable. Sorry?
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, it's all right.
So we've reached the end of our time. I think that these questions are all so interesting for us to continue to have conversations about, and I hope that this has stimulated further thought for all of us. It definitely has for me. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.